I've been sort of a very happy bystander over the years, as Livia has sort of engaged in this incredible quest to find out about a fascinating person and actually a fascinating period in history, which I mean, I know the book was meant to address a specific person, a specific point in time, but in fact it becomes a huge fresco, which is really sort of wonderful sort of to discover, sort of like peeling back the layers. We have a lot to get through, so I thought that we might just start by asking Livia how the first seeds of this quest were sown, and what launched her on this long journey.
So thank you to all the friends that I see here tonight and the people that also I don't know that came to listen to us. The first thing I wish to say is the first seed was planted before, but the first seed for the publication of this book came from you, Tash, if you remember. Because once I told him here in Paris, we were in the Rue du Bac, he came to have a drink and said, what are you working on? I said, oh, I have this idea, but I'm not sure. And he said, no, I think you should do it. And I think also, you know, that I can introduce you to my agent who would be just the right person. It turned out that the agent became another one, but it was the first time that I thought it could really be a book. So thank you. The seed. Oh, first of all, there are seats in front. Please come. The seed is just a sparkle of curiosity. I was in Bombay in 2007 because I was working on a profile of the Indian and now also American writer Vikram Chandra. And after spending a few days with him, who illustrated the city for me and so on, I decided to stay one more day after he left, went back to Berkeley where he teaches. And I was just, you know, a day of tourism in a very peculiar moment of my life, as my only brother had died a week before and 2 days before boarding the plane. I went to his funeral. So I was in a cloud of grief, and I went to the major museum of Bombay, whose name I can't pronounce, but it used to be called then the Prince of Wales Museum. And I saw that there was an exhibition that I thought I wasn't interested in, but I stayed because it was too hot to go out. And I looked at it, and the exhibition was photographs of Maharanis and Maharajas of the 1920s and 30s that were discovered recently, just a few years before, in an attic. It was the archive of a photographer who was famous then and then disappeared after his business went bust in the 1950s. And so these pictures were basically never seen before. Among them, I wasn't attuned to it. I didn't think I was so interested in them, but then I was really struck by one particular picture. And maybe the best thing is to read you what it was from the book. It was a full-length portrait of a slender young woman whose grace in that setting shone like a ray of light. Tall, dark-skinned, her hair tied up, she wore an impalpable, translucent sari, its edges embroidered with gold or silver thread, hard to say in a black and white photo. The label identified her as Her Royal Highness Rani Shri Amrit Kaur Sahib, the sole female child of the Maharaja Jagajit Singh Bahadur of Kapurthala and his fourth wife, Rani Kanari. The photograph was dated 24 June 1924, 1 year after the princess's marriage to the Raja Joginder Sen Bahadur of Mandi, when the young newlyweds visited London and were received by King George and Queen Mary. There was one detail in particular, according to the exhibition's curator, Russell Harris, that set this particular portrait apart. In contrast to the splendor of her sari and the theatricality of the setting, the Rani wore relatively little jewelry, the sign of a certain originality, since, so said the wall note, her father annually spent up to a quarter of his revenue buying swags of pearls and heavy emeralds to adorn himself. There was no question that amid the dazzling display of princes surrounding her, the Rani of Mandi's choice to wear only a necklace of diamonds cabochon and too long string of pearls seems to almost an act of modesty, or else, as the curator suggested, the sign of a singular character. But what really caught my attention was the last part of the photograph's description. A letter received, so this is quote, a letter received by her father's fifth wife, the former flamenco dancer Anita Delgado, contained a report that the Rani of Mandi had been arrested by the Gestapo in occupied Paris on the accusation of having sold her jewelry to help Jews leave the country. The letter stated that the Rani survived less than a year in a Nazi imprisonment. An incredible story, I remember thinking, as I stepped back to get a better look at this alluring woman. How could such an act have gone unnoticed? A gorgeous Punjabi princess, sick by fate, who risks her life in occupied Paris to help Jews and ends up being murdered by Nazis. And then I skip a little bit. And so this adventure began as a jolt of curiosity amid a haze of lingering grief, when a pervading sense of loss had obscured my past and future. Little did I imagine that the desire to solve the mystery tied to that inscrutable face would take me into the new life I was poised to begin in Paris, actually. So this is how it began.
I'd like to come back later in the talk to that particular point in your life and your state of being there, which I find incredibly sort of fascinating and very moving, and in the ways that intersects with your quest for Amrit, to know more about Amrit Kaur. But maybe we could just sort of start by, because I think some people might have read the book or read parts of the book, but I think a lot of people also are new to Amrit Kaur. Maybe we could start about talking about the woman herself, her origins, how she grew up, and how, as you found out more about her, you became even more interested in her.
Yes, she was born in 1904 in the little kingdom of the Punjab, and she had 5 brothers, no sisters, and a very imposing father, and many stepmothers. The father had 6 wives and also concubines. And she was born in a family that was unique, apparently, in India, among the royal families of India, because they were very, very dedicated Francophiles, to the point that at the royal court, everybody had to speak French, including the servants. And that, the father made sure that Victor Hugo was taught in school to all the Indian children of the little kingdom. And they had a house in Paris that still exists. It's called Pavillon Capurtala in Bois de Boulogne, where the father spent a lot of time and gave marvelous parties and so on. So she was sent to study in the West. She was educated in England mostly, but also apparently also in France, although I couldn't find where. And she grew up in a Sikh family, which is absolutely essential to understand her personality, because the Sikhs, for the Sikhs, women and men are equal. So she was a princess, the only daughter in a family, in a society for which she was equal to any man, and she was very strong-willed, and she was very cultivated too. The school where she was sent was quite amazing, actually. That was a big surprise for me. It was a school that was open to a lot of faiths. 30% of the girls were Jewish, which justified probably, what was said at the beginning, what I said at the beginning. And she was, the first thing that I found out is that she was the head of the jazz band of the school. This was, of course, all girls. And this was in the late 1910s, I think, or beginning of the 1920s. I mean, jazz was just born in New Orleans. So they were very advanced. They were very open. One of, the sister of the school, not director, headmaster, was at the most important impresario of Covent Garden at the time. So he would bring tenors and singers and actors to give lectures at the school. And the nearby neighbor was Ernest Shackleton, the explorer, who would also go there to entertain the girls with the stories of his adventures. So, I mean, I tried to picture this girl that at the age of 18, after having lived all this, which is absolutely exceptional. I wish I had lived there. Is told, well, now you go home and you marry another 18 years old guy who is of a small kingdom and who's never left India before and speaks English, yes, but that's it. And this is going to be your life in a tiny place, little city, not, it's a village really, at the foothill of the Himalaya. And you're going to go there. That's it, finished, it's all over.
But
didn't work.
It didn't work in quite spectacular fashion, but maybe this is a good point to talk about, to tell us a little bit about her father,
Yes.
Jagatjit Singh, because the book is full of, as you say, very, very powerful women, very strong, independently minded women. There's her, there's Brinda.
True.
And a lot of it is about this relationship between the kind of also the men in this world, notably the father, who is a very, very colorful figure.
He's a very colorful figure. First of all, well, one thing that I found out halfway through is that he was adopted. So he was actually the son of, a poor woman, a poor couple in Kapurthala that was snatched right after birth because his official father was mentally sick, couldn't have children, and so they decided, this apparently was done sometimes, So he was a changeling, very, very smart, apparently knew 11 languages, extremely cosmopolitan, a great traveler, and very, very curious, not very Anglophile, detested by Lord Curzon, who was then the viceroy, and really loathed, I would say,
because he found him frivolous.
Because he found him frivolous, because he was coming to Paris all the time, where he had lots of mistresses,
Not just mistress, he liked marrying as well. He's like,
and also he liked marrying, and the British detested mixed marriages, and which weren't very popular with the Indians either. So he kind of,
Fourth wife was Spanish, and then
his
there's
the first four or three
three
were Indian,
Indian,
then Spanish,
Spanish,
then
Czech.
and then the last one is a Czech, was a Czech actress, sort of actress, daughter of sort of a count, and who, and the book, my research was full of these absurd stories. Like, this woman was very unhappily married with him, and after her mother and her grandmother, who had followed her to Kapurthala, were found dead, maybe apparently because they were poisoned. She, understandably, she becomes a little paranoid, and she decides to run away. And she runs away when her husband is very far, and she goes to Delhi. The English don't give her her passport. She's stuck. She cannot leave. She's desperate, and so she climbs the highest minaret in not only India. I think maybe it's the highest in the world. The Qutub Minar, and she throws herself down with her two Pomeranians under, under the arms. And so she dies. And since then, you cannot climb to the top. Wow. Yeah, it's forbidden. Yeah, and I discovered that this is because. So everything was very weird, very strange.
Just as an aside at this point, she was very unhappy. She was never accepted.
She was never accepted.
She was never accepted
by the British and by the Indians.
And by the Indians.
She was in a horrible position.
But curiously enough, the Spanish wife was more successful at that.
Yeah, because she was very smart.
How did she do that?
I think just by being smart, and I don't have proofs of how she did it, but it is telling the fact that when she married the Maharaja, she was 17 or 16. And then, of course, they moved in Paris, and then they moved to Kapurthala. And she saw a very beautiful piece of jewelry on an elephant, on the forehead of an elephant of all places. And she said, I'd like to have it. And the husband said, I'll give it to you if you learn Hindustani, which I never understood whether it's Hindi or Urdu or
Punjabi. Yeah.
Punjabi. Yeah. I made a lot of research about it, but anyway, she did learn it. And so she got her magnificent emerald that she wore on her head, on her forehead.
So Amrit Kaur grows up with a father like this, which I think inevitably casts a shadow. I mean, you know that is what a father's capable of. That's what a husband is capable of. She's nonetheless incredibly independently minded. She then, as you say, comes back and marries a provincial. What happens then?
Well, she marries and she goes to live in this place that is I became really fascinated by, apart from after going there and seeing what it was like, but also by the fact that another incredible coincidence. It was the very place where Alexander the Great had to stop because his army rebelled. And he built their 12 famous altars that then were dismantled and there cannot be found anymore. But it was an incredible place. It was a crossroad of market, almost medieval. To this day, it looks almost medieval. And it was interesting. It had lots of over 300 temples, Hindu temples, and a community that is not clear how much she was involved with, but I suppose she was, of settlers, of British settlers, with quite adventurous people who first came working for the state, for the empire, and then when they were told to, just controlling that things were done in the right way, because the British were controlling, of course, these royal families and their governments. When they were told to move somewhere else, decided they wouldn't leave, and so they stayed, and they formed a community growing apple trees and other fruit trees, and that, and then the fruits were sold in Simla, which was the center in the summer of the court.
And what was, I mean, how marriage for her was?
Marriage for her was apparently hell. They didn't get along at all. I saw her. I mean, I suppose these were her books more than her husband's books, because even her husband's children, I mean, and her children admitted that he wasn't a very cultivated man. And I saw the library they have when I went there, and it was incredible. I mean, there was everything from, all Flaubert, all Balzac, all the great French, all the great Russians, all the fundamental books of the Indian culture. Plus, I don't know, from Mein Kampf to the letters of Sacco and Vanzetti. Really quite fascinating so it was completely international. And she had 2 children officially, then unofficially I discovered 2 more who died right after birth. And she had, and she was during the 1920s, she was very involved into women's rights, in the fights for women's rights, really on the front line of these women's conferences, opening the conferences with speeches that said, she was an advocate for women's free education for all Indian women, against child marriage, and against polygamy. And then her husband takes another wife. So she's publicly humiliated.
That was it was a very humiliating event for her.
Who doesn't speak a word of even English. She just speaks Gujarati, and who's considered everything she's not: vulgar, greedy, and so on. And he starts another family with this woman.
That's I mean, I found that moment sort of such a sort of a moving moment. I mean, you don't dwell on it so much, but describe how then things start to sort of drift apart, and she then finds her way back to Europe.
Things start to drift apart because of this, and probably what I find, at the very end of my quest, at the very end of the book. Sorry, I see people standing. There are places. Okay, all right. What she does is I think she was probably also maneuvered by the new wife to leave. The women didn't have the right to own anything apart from jewelry. Officially were really unimportant and didn't have any power, but they had household power that was huge. And this husband that she had, the Raja of Mandi, was, as even his grandson says, soft. So they were maneuvered, and she left in 1933.
What do you think her? I mean, I know it's very difficult because a lot of this question is about sort of trying to sort of guess what the person was feeling, what the person might have been thinking. But for someone such as herself, who was very westernized in some ways, had incredible, rich Western education, that clash of civilization, that culture, do you think that she lived that? It was very painful because Princess Brinda, who married the eldest son of Jagajit Singh, says something which I thought was incredibly moving. I was not European enough to give up everything for love. My Indian training would not let me forget about my responsibilities so quickly, because she also
Yes, I think it was the same thing. We're talking about people who also were very entitled. You know, they thought they came from royal families. They thought they had a certain role, and it was very important for them. Um, One thing that I just before there's, I may have created a misunderstanding. I just want to make this clear because it's really important. This is not a biography. If you think you're reading a biography, you're going to be disappointed. This is the story of a quest. It is a rather mad story because it's the story of me becoming obsessed with this figure, um, not by chance, for many reasons, one of which is that she was deleted by history, deleted by the family for very good reasons, because there was a scandal behind that I'm not going to tell you before you read the book, because so no one wanted me to know what really happened. And also, a lot of things were deleted here because not many French people wanted to, make available in the archives what was done to the so-called alien enemies, to the English that were arrested, English, British subjects that were arrested here in 1940, and to the Jews, of course. So the obsession came from the fact that she was interesting, but she was unreachable, and she was unreachable for very good reasons. And I only grasped it at the end.
Well, and so much of the book is filled with these instances of frustration where you come back from Bombay or Delhi after having gone out to speak to people and come back sort of empty-handed, so that there is that sense of a quest that it just is giving you the answers. And as a very experienced sort of writer and journalist, that must have been, was that difficult? How difficult was that for you just to...
Oh, oddly enough, my bad character, helped me. The more you put obstacles in front of me, the more I am determined to overcome them. So, it really motivated me to go on beyond any reasonable.
Because one of the instances of the deletion that you talk about, which I found myself getting very kind of worked up about when I read about it in the book, was now back in Europe. So Amrit Kaur is now back in Europe. She at some point flees Belgium to come to Paris. And Paris is
Yes.
already in a very uncertain state. This is just before the German actually, it is during the German.
They're all coming from Belgium because the Germans have a right in Belgium already. So it's a question of
But
weeks.
even Paris is already in a very
Yes.
uncertain state.
Yes.
What happens then?
What happens is that she arrives in Paris and she's arrested. She's arrested the 8th of December 1940, together with 3,600 other women and children, with British subjects. Everybody thought the men had already been arrested and sent to Drancy, and from Drancy to the camps and to Germany, and it was horror. But everybody thought that they wouldn't touch the women and the children. And instead, no, in 1 week. And who arrested them? The gendarmerie, French gendarmerie, and gave them to the Germans. They volunteered apparently to do this. And they were sent, and this is one of the weirdest part of the story for me, because they were sent to an internment camp in Besançon, which was not obviously a camp for the final solution, but became a camp almost for the final solution, because 600 died within the first month. There was no heating. It was December. It was snowing. There was very little, if no food. I mean, the hygienic situation was a disaster. And so they fell ill and they died. Not all of them. So this was terrible. And I knew what happened. I knew the date of her arrest and the address in the 16th arrondissement because of a dossier that I had found on her, that I had found at the British Library. Um, because the fact that she was the wife of a ruler of the empire and the daughter of another ruler of the empire was a headache for the Foreign Office. They couldn't ignore it, although they weren't really interested, but they couldn't completely ignore it. So they were paying a spy to spy, to tell what was going on. The spy was actually another incredible thing. Had turned out to be the head of the counter um, secret service of Vichy. So a very, very important spy. Anyway, he sent this telegram saying that she was arrested. And in England, I found books of some of the survivors who had told their stories to grandchildren who wanted to know. They interviewed them, and so the stories became, books that I could read, and I could see what had happened in this terrible camp of Besançon. Nothing was here. No, I couldn't find anything here. And I asked a lot. I asked historians, journalists,
You asked an
diplomats.
awful lot of people. You list the number of
Yeah,
people you asked, and no
nothing,
one knew.
And
No one.
and even a friend um, whose family estate has been for centuries in Besançon, she said, no, never heard of anything like that. It can't be, and instead it was true. It was, but it was erased. And even at the archive of the prefecture here in Paris, there was nothing. And when I insisted,
No details of her arrest
or anybody's else arrest, and when I really insisted, I said, I want to talk to the director. It has to be here. And the director came, and she was very kind, and she said, I think there's been a fire. And it was one of the not very few fires that I encountered. And
because you had seen in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, that's what you had firm evidence. So you knew
I saw the telegram. I actually saw the actual telegram that the Foreign Office received about her arrest. So it was not. I mean, so.
And what happens thereafter? So the length of time she spends under arrest in this camp.
She spent 6 months there, and during these 6 months, a lot of things that are really interesting that are told by these English books happened. Many of the women arrested were nuns, for instance. Also, many of them were prostitutes. All sorts of, women from all levels of society. And they managed to survive, as it happens always, to find a way to survive. Many fell into depressions, some were suicidal, many things happened. She was liberated after 6 months. Well, the very worst part comes at the end, when they, trains with Jews start arriving, and then leaving also to be taken to Poland and to Germany, and these people, these women, and with their children, some of them tried to commit suicide before being put on the trains, because already in the camp the news of the camps had arrived, and so they knew what they were going to face. And it was, really terrible to read that they were put in the trains, half dead, terribly injured, if they hadn't managed to kill themselves. She has a different destiny. After 6 months, the camp is closed because of a visit of the Red Cross, and they're moving everybody to the camp of Vittel. Vitel was much better because it was a spa city with a lot of empty hotels, so they could stay in the hotels. And this happened when the American women were also arrested at that point. America had entered the war. So the Americans had better fate than the British. And she is liberated. Why? It's not clear. Certainly her father tried an exchange of prisoners with a very important German spy that the English, I saw the document, said she's not, the Rani of Mandi is not important enough to liberate this spy, so no way. But there was a woman that was with her and was very, very close to her. I don't want to go more into this. An American woman who sold everything she had in California, where she was from, in order to get money to get out of there. And they managed, apparently they managed to corrupt the Vichy authorities and also the German authorities, which is unheard of, but yeah, they did leave.
There is, I think the more we talk, this comes to the crux of the matter, and I want to leave a little bit of time to ask you a few questions about to come back to your connection with the story, because you mentioned that when you first set off for India to do this profile on Bikram Chandra, the writer, your brother had just died. But also you talk about how you had just also in the process of moving to Paris because you had your own life was changing.
Yes.
And are you able to talk a little bit? Because
Sure.
to me that I felt that was somehow you don't do any sort of artificial leaps to try and make links between your life and Amrit Kaur's, and there's nothing as sort of as gauche as that in the book. But I still felt it was something important in the book that somehow I wanted more of that. I wanted to know more, and this is kind of my chance to ask you how these two destinies sort of intersect, or whether they do intersect.
Well, they did. They did. It was obviously by chance. I didn't choose Paris because of this, but it was actually peculiar, the coincidence that this woman had moved to Paris, never to come back to India, and had abandoned her daughter, which is something that I discovered right away, and I befriended her daughter, who was almost 80 when I met her, and she's still alive, and who kind of set a trap for me, really lured me into doing all this research. The price to pay was a book, but she she hadn't anticipated what this meant. Doing all this research because she was abandoned by her mother in 1933 when Amrit Kaur went to Paris, never to return to India, and didn't know why. And and she had a relatively happy life. And she's a very wise woman and a wonderful woman. But she really didn't want to die without knowing. It was something that was tormenting her. So I'm saying this also because the theme that runs through this book from the very beginning to the end is loss. I was facing my own loss. I was facing this touching woman's loss, who made me go to interview her to Pune from here, from Paris. I mean, 7,000 kilometers just to tell me that she didn't know anything about her mother. And she wanted to know what I had already found out in these archives about her mother. So, and then there was the fact that I found myself at a crossroad in my own life. I had separated from my husband 5 years before, kept the family together because it was very important for me. We had 2 children, and I had very good relationship with my husband, so he would come often to see them at home. But at a certain point, my son, at the age of 18, went to study in London, and I was about to put my daughter through high school here at the age of 14. No, not here, sorry, Milan, at the age of 14, when I thought I always wanted to live abroad. Why am I doing this? I mean, we had this huge apartment that was by that point almost empty. She's going to go through high school and then she's going to leave like her, rightly so, like her brother did. And I'm going to stay. I don't wanted to stay. So we came to Paris because Paris was exotic to me. New York was my second home. London, I knew very well. I've always written about American and English writers and English language writers for the Corriere della Sera. So that's why I knew very well these places. And I wanted to be in a place that was new and where I didn't know anyone and I didn't even speak French. So it was a complete kamikaze move. But we survived.
I remember the year you moved, and
Yeah.
it seemed to be such a sort of a huge event.
Well, it was.
I know, when you mention it, every time it surfaces in the book, I find it very touching because when you talk about how you, there's so much of it is about motherhood. When you talk about how Amrit Kaur could have abandoned her two children
Sure.
at specifically the time when you were negotiating this sort of the space between, being a mother and having your children somewhere else.
Absolutely. And I was very, very close to my daughter. So, I mean, for me, it was the opposite situation. I had done it, just in the opposite way. But this is also why I was, asking myself, what could have made her do something so radical? So, of course, the war was a factor then, but she moved in 33. So the war was coming only in 7 years. So it was a big act of rebellion. If you want to see it interpreted in a more contemporary way, this is also a woman's liberation story. She really, with a huge shrug, got rid of her husband, her 5 brothers, her her father,
His father and his
and was
wives.
never ever in touch with them again. So big thing. For me, it was very different. But yes, there is, it goes through the pages also my sense of being disoriented when I was at the beginning in Paris, and at the same time enticed totally, how what a wonderful thing is to live in a new place. Everything, there are so many things to discover.
Yeah, and my sense of you at the time was certainly that it was something you had to do, and it was sort of inevitable that you had to do this, and that is a sort of it's something I sort of recognize as I read your account of your search of for answers in Amrit Kaur's life. And so much of it to her felt like it was she she was impelled to do it. I mean, that there wasn't any other way to live her life. We have a few minutes for a few questions, but before we go there, another question um about how this quest was sometimes received. There's a very famous dinner party that you were invited to in India, where the host was furious with you when you arrive. He then sort of softens, but he hates the idea of you coming and asking questions.
Yes, that was an important moment in general in my life, in my professional life, because I had been a cultural journalist for this newspaper for many, many, many years. And I had written one book before embarking in this one. But it was the first book was a bit of the result of what the work I had done for many years for the newspaper, reflecting on American writers and so on. The way I was, let's say, greeted by this cousin, relative of Amrit Kaur, who detested the idea of someone writing a book about another book on the family, because the others had been written not about her, but other members of the family. And they were quite salacious and, scandalous and so on. Um, he uh, he treated me with such he insulted me for literally 45 minutes, shouting, and not I hadn't said a word. I mean, just shook his hand and started shouting. And I remember, I had 45 minutes to think what to do. What do I do? I mean, first of all, I didn't know how to get home. It's not Delhi. It's not a place I wasn't right in the center where you just go out and stop a taxi like you do in New York or maybe even here. So I didn't know what to do. He was shouting against me, and I was obviously embarrassed, offended, all, and I thought, no, I go, I leave, but then I thought, how can I possibly leave? It's so surreal. I've been invited to dinner and then insulted, and then I leave without saying a word. I mean, what does it mean?
It was so violent that you find out later that people have been
Yeah,
standing outside and listening to the tirade.
Yes, because there were other guests, except that they didn't dare to come in, hearing, this man shouting.
So can you explain? Was it the fact that he felt that that you were Western? At one point, he says it, because you're a Westerner, and then that's one of the things that he objects to.
Well, yes, and this is, when just to finish what I was saying before that I haven't finished, is that was the first and only moment in my life in which I thought, shut up, you're a writer and this is interesting. You have to stay. Yeah. And it was interesting because he said a lot of things in 45 minutes, among which, it was crescendo. It was, in the end, it was, now you Europeans are on your knees and you'll see what we're capable of, what a great nation is India, and so on. So it hadn't happened to me to hear something like this before. So it was interesting. And the funny thing is that, with a little pride left, when all these other people, 15 guests, arrived and were looking at me, obviously asking themselves, what has she done? She must have killed the dog, or obviously they were puzzled, and looked at me like I was a monster. And I hadn't said a single word since I had arrived. So when he finally stopped, I said, you didn't ask me who I am and why I'm here. So now I'm going to tell you, and then I'm leaving. So I'm so-and-so, and I'm here, and I'm telling the story of seeing that picture in a museum and being, spending a lot of time making research and meeting the daughter, Bubbles, the daughter of Amrit Kaur, and this woman wanted to know what happened to her mother before dying. And when I mentioned this in particular, I see everybody's expression change. And, everybody's smiling, except him, all of a sudden. And there is even a woman who says, but this is marvelous. And I thought, what the hell is going on here? And so the waiter, a servant comes in and says that the dinner is ready. And I thought, okay, I'm staying. Because they all volunteered to talk to me, saying, my father was a friend of hers, my aunt, my grandfather, and said, okay, that's a good thing. I'm going to ask.
Was that the only sort of example of resistance or do you ever feel that actually I can't go on with this? This is,
It wasn't the only example of resistance. No, other cousins of Bubbles, of the daughter, that she made me, put me in contact with. One said, no way. I was in Delhi to see them, and said, no, I'm not seeing you. I'm not interested. Another one, who was also a friend of many friends of mine, so he knew exactly who I was and so on, sent me a message saying, I'm busy all winter. So I was, so no, everybody wasn't happy. And I didn't know why yet.
I have lots more questions, but I think we should open the floor. So if anyone has any questions, this is the moment. You have Livia here. There will be time to have sort of private questions later, but I know there will be people with burning questions. So
can we have a big round of applause, please? Thank you.
And then we'll go to
okay, yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. For me, it's a kind of thriller book. By the way, I come from Punjab and I'm half Sikh.
Really?
Yeah,
From where in Punjab?
District Ludhiana, which is something like, I think 70 kilometers from Kapurthala.
So very close.
Yeah. So I just wanted to carry on with the conversation, difficult conversation that you had with the relative of the gentleman, the princess who insulted you. When you finished writing your book, did you send him your book and what was the feedback?
No, I didn't send him my book, and I didn't mention his name in the book. I think he should buy it, honestly. He's very motivated to buy it, or maybe not. Maybe he doesn't want to know, and it's fine. I really, though, made the point to, not. There was a scandal behind this story. Today it would be absolutely not as scandalous, but for the time it was. And I made a point not to underline this or not, it's really the story of a quest of how much you find out about the world. For me, it was all new. I mean, I've been to India, but I didn't know basically anything that then I had to write about, and how much you get to know about yourself, and the real motives for dedicating so many years to a crazy project like this. So no, he'll buy the book.
Other
There's a question
questions
here,
in the front row?
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I'm wondering if she ever came across in Paris Amrita Singh, the famous painter.
Yes, actually, interesting that you ask. Definitely, yes, they were friends. And I discovered question mark. Yes, question mark. Well, there was maybe 10 years age difference. And I found out about it because when I went to Mandi, in the what is left, say, of the royal palace, that was transformed into a hotel, there was also a private apartment of Babul's half brother, and who was, let's say, the titles don't count anymore, but the Raja of Mandi himself. And they had two paintings of Amrita Shalgil. That's where I saw them. And I said, how come? And he said, my father and Amrit Kaur were close friends. Not, he didn't know about Paris, but he knew about Lahore when Amrita Shalgil was in Lahore at the end of her life. And so I don't know. This is stayed a question mark for me too.
Next book.
Hi, I just wondered if you ever thought of, at any point in the process of writing a novel instead and fictionalizing it and filling in the gaps in your imagination.
No, novels are not for me. Unfortunately, I'd love to. No, I would feel I love storytelling. I mean, this is obviously a work of storytelling, but making things up, I really love narrating stories with true facts, making the effort of putting everything together. But I don't like to invent. But although I love reading novels, written by others.
I think there's an urgency in the storytelling. So, you know, you get to certain moments and suddenly it's filled with attention. And sometimes I feel the tension comes from particularly the fact that there are these silences. You know, actually that whole passage where you talk about the deletion of information about the prison camp in Besançon, it's filled with a kind of, you know, what are you going to find, in a way that I think, had you invented something to sort of fill in the gaps, possibly less powerful to me.
Yes, actually, I faced the opposite problem. Sometimes the gaps were filled by things that, you know, looked made up, like in a bad novel. Well, you'll find out, those who haven't read the book will find out, but you know, after all those silences and no one wanting to tell me the story, and the fires that destroyed the archives, and when I had nothing in my hands, very serendipitously I found, someone helped me to find an email sent by a woman years before to another writer who was working on another character of this family, saying that she had found a briefcase full of letters and photographs of Amrit Kaur, of her, that was abandoned in, of all places, in San Diego, California in 1938. And the woman turned out to be a stripper. I mean, I would have never dared to invent something like this.
I think your editor might have just, you know, some improbable plot twist.
I thought this is impossible, and you know, the book is also a lot about my own prejudices, and you know how I had to face the fact that how it's so prejudiced. I mean, this is impossible, and you know, being prejudiced, she's going to ask me a lot of money, and I don't know how to pay. And it wasn't true, of course. You know, she volunteered all this stuff, scanned it, sent it. Then I went to California to thank her and to interview her. But yeah, so how can you make up something like this?
Yeah, it's very different, but it's also, I think that's what's so moving in the book. And you know, every time where you're actually constantly challenging your own perception of things and your own way of being and your own way of thinking. Like, for example, when you go to Paris to meet someone who seems to be an older lady who seems to be the epitome of grace, and whose life seems totally ordered, and whose apartment is absolutely totally ordered, and you never once thought that anything terrible or tragic could have lain behind the facade of this perfection, and in fact you discover it had.
Yeah, and it was so, this lady had met people of the Kapurtala family, and they were very, very close. So she was an important interviewee for me. But
Princess Brinda had stayed with
Princess Brinda, who was
family.
Amrit Kaur's sister-in-law, had lived with her. And I remember, because I had just moved to Paris and because of other things that happened in my life that were very positive, I was anxious. And I remember the overwhelming feeling of serenity, and, you know, I could finally breathe in this beautiful apartment that was perfect. Everything was perfect about it. I mean, it was beautiful. It was perfect in a predictable way, if you want, you know. But also that was reassuring.
It was very ordered.
Ordered, and the colors were just great, and the flowers were peonies, of course, and you know, and the gouache on the walls were views of the Vesuvio, of course. Just fantastic, and I was surprised by my own sense of being happy there. You know, finally, for half an hour, I can let go this anxiety. And then when I came home, talking to my friend Priscilla, who's here tonight, who had introduced me to this lady, I found out that an unspeakable, unimaginable tragedy had happened to her. Her daughter and two grandchildren were murdered by the daughter's husband. And and I thought, how, first thing you think is, how can she has possibly survived, such a pain, terrible, terrible story. And then the other thing that was an intuition was that this wonderful grace and beauty and refinement of this apartment was a wall built against the horrors of the wall. I mean, inside, even I felt I was safe, and I would have stayed if I could, forever. And so that what she made to
Maybe that's what you connected with, this hidden
I think,
upheaval.
yeah, I think so. So yeah, there are a lot of revelations.
But yes, but the writerly sense of of actually self-interrogation, I found was
Yeah.
very sort of strong in the book. We might have time for one more question, I think, if there is one.
Super interesting, everything you've said, and I can't wait to read the book. I haven't done so yet. You started off talking about this intriguing lady by saying that you saw her portrait and you read that she had sold her jewels to save
Yes.
Jewish people. So I wonder if you just talked about your intuition as well. Was that what intrigued you? Was it the photograph? Was it your intuition that this was something that you were meant to follow? Or I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about that. And also about the fact that, this Indian woman was able to leave because she took her jewels with her, right? Because that was her only property. And then she ended up selling them to help others.
Well, this is the mystery part that guides the book. So I cannot go too much into details. Yes, in principle, it is like you said. One of the problems, though, the first thing that I discovered is when you have such important jewelry by Cartier, Boucheron, Chaumet, and all these great Parisian jewelers made with Indian stones, obviously, that the Maharajas brought here. The way to resell them is to go to the jewelers who originally did them, who, because of their deontology, which makes a lot of sense, don't allow anyone to know when a client comes back, because is either in difficulty or wants to help someone. Doesn't matter. They don't say a word. So I couldn't find anything about it. Why I thought it was enticing? Well, you know how Schindler's List got to be written. I do because I read Thomas Keneally's autobiography. There was in Australia, I think in Sydney, there was a salesman working in a shoe store where Keneally went to buy shoes, and he said, "I have an interesting story to tell you about the Holocaust. May I?" And he said yes. And then he told the story of Schindler's List, and Keneally happened to be like the 50th person to whom this salesman, elderly gentleman, had told the story. No one did anything with it. No one said, "Oh, let's see, it's interesting. Let's see what it is." Of course, it took a writer, to say, "Well, I want to know about it." And so it was my instinct as a journalist and a writer not to let this thing pass. And also because, what made it even more interesting was that it came from the research about a picture that was found only 2 or 3 years before. It was not a story it wasn't known because even the picture wasn't known. So no one at the Victoria and Albert Museum that curated the show had looked into it, so it was new.